These two young ladies don't know this, but while they're sitting around worrying about where, at this time of night in Tokyo on March the 25th, 2007, their cherished flatmate is, the said individual isn't well, but she is alive. Conversely, when, in response to the report of the following morning from these two flatmates, two young English teachers on an adventure out in Japan, just like their friend, that their other flatmate is missing, the police initially don't lift a finger. That doesn't make any difference to the fate of their friend. At this point though, the police aren't aware of that, so... You see, 22-year-old Lindsay Hawker, the missing flatmate who comes from Coventry in England, has crossed paths, very sadly, with a secret psychopath. And with Lindsay now lying in his bathtub with a gag down her throat, all her hair gone, and with plant seeds no less feeding on her flesh, this twisted individual has since gone from medical school dropout to awkward social misfit to murderer. Born on January the 5th, 1979 in Gifu Prefecture, Tokyo, Tatsuya Ichihashi was the son of a doctor and a dentist, his father and mother respectively. Coming as such from a distinctly privileged background, Ichihashi aspired all throughout his schooling to following his father's footsteps into a career as a doctor. He fucked up in the exams that he had to take to get into medical school though, but ended up studying the next best thing. Horticulture, of course. Well, I can mock the guy, but firstly, horticulture is an academic discipline, and secondly, having studied at the private and prestigious Chiba University, he graduated in 2005 with quite good grades. Now, if you're enjoying this video so far, do subscribe, give the video a like, drop a comment when you're ready, and donate. Hit the thanks button below, I'll appreciate you. The thing is though, after seeing his ambition to join his father as a doctor shatter, Ichihashi began to lose his way, if you will. Reports from classmates and acquaintances describe him as quiet and introverted, though not outwardly hostile. However, beneath this reserved exterior of his, Ichihashi exhibited troubling behavioural patterns. He was said to have had difficulty forming genuine relationships and often kept to himself, which may have contributed to his psychological issues later in life. Ichihashi's personality is often described as socially awkward, manipulative and controlling. There is little evidence that Ichihashi had meaningful romantic relationships or a stable social circle. His inability to form deep connections might have contributed to his emotional instability and his criminal tendencies, the latter actually not having had their first outing, if you like, with Lindsay Hawker. Around 6 years before he targeted Lindsay, you see, on failing in his attempt to steal a woman's bag, Ichihashi proceeded to beat the woman up. The incident, even though it was reported to the police, never got to court because Ichihashi's father, most likely trying to protect his family's image and reputation, which, in a country like Japan are all so important, met with the woman and paid her a bribe of approximately $10,000 to walk away. Now, this guy's father is a doctor. On discovering his son's attack on the said woman, he would have been alive, I'd say, to the potential for seriously psychopathic and antisocial personality disorders burgeoning inside of his son. And actually, it doesn't take a fucking doctor to see that. But, as we've seen, keeping up his family's respectable appearance was the one priority for the guy's father. It seems he didn't even require his son to attend some sort of therapy in order to unravel why he had done what he had done and to at least try to prevent all such behaviour in future. So, where Ichihashi is concerned, we've got, at this point, a guy who fundamentally feels like a loser and who, work-wise, no longer has any ambition. With an obvious empathy deficit, as attested by his said criminal acts, his day-to-day is characterised by social isolation, and he has now been given the message that his father can buy him out of trouble with the law. A recipe, quite clearly, for disaster. I've mentioned that Ichihashi had no ambitions in the world of work anymore. After graduating, he made no effort whatsoever to find a job. That's the precise truth. Incredibly, instead of pushing their son to get his shit together and get a job, the guy's parents started giving him the equivalent of about $900 a month to live on. With this allowance, Ichihashi was able to afford an apartment of his own. Even so, the man's mental health appears to have just got worse and worse, the few people in his life noticing his increasingly reclusive, withdrawn and unsettling behaviour, the exact details of which, I couldn't trace. I can tell you though that the perpetrator's relationship with the girlfriend that he had managed to get forget was, when he targeted Lindsay, all but over, having endured a whole year, mind. Ichihashi went to the gym every single day, which is actually a healthy habit, I'd say, unless you're over-exercising. I don't know if a daily 25-kilometre run is over-exercising, but this is what Ichihashi generally did at the gym. And, you never know, this might just make it easy for the bloke to chase a lone young woman from England, for instance, through the narrow streets of her part of Tokyo, while she's on her bike even, until she reaches her flat, at which point he has the daring to ask her for one-to-one English lessons. When, on the 20th of March 2007, Ichihashi accosts Lindsay after eyeing her up just before all throughout their subway journey, when Lindsay was oblivious to him as he's a complete stranger. She's unlocking her bike from where she left it parked earlier and wondering, I reckon, who the fuck this bloke who's just accosted her and announced that she's his English teacher is. He fucking well isn't in any of the classes that she teaches at her school, but unlike me, Lindsay is telling him that and telling him to go away in a notably polite way. In fact, everyone who knew Lindsay later said what a kind and courteous person she was, and Ichihashi himself later testified to her politeness towards him. I'm guessing that white people visiting Tokyo were often working as English teachers, and this is what prompted Ichihashi to assume that Lindsay was, likewise, an English teacher. It seems that his targeting of Lindsay came about from his seeing her on the underground and liking what he saw, which includes the fact that she was alone. Random and opportunistic. The fact that he doesn't seem concerned about how crazy his statement that he's a student of Lindsay's must sound to Lindsay can only point, to use a legal term, to an abnormality of mental functioning on his part. This is just my ignorant opinion, of course, but keep in mind the man's previous attack on another woman and the reports of his being a socially awkward misfit with few to no friends, except his lingering ex-girlfriend. I'll say more about her a bit later. And essentially, he had nothing meaningful to live for, as far as I'm aware. These aren't necessarily the signs of an AMF, but there is clearly something seriously wrong with this guy. Now, Lindsay doesn't know that. As she pedals as fast as she can through the narrow streets that lead to her flat, the narrow streets limiting her speed, sadly, she's trying and failing to shake off someone who runs 25 kilometres a day and who is, as such, easily able to keep up with her cycling by running. Now, come on, Lindsay. After telling you that you know each other, this stranger is now asking you, as he runs alongside you while you're pedalling away on your bike, what your name is, where you're from, how old you are, and other such questions, demonstrating that he obviously has a screw loose, in my ignorant opinion. The last thing you're going to do then is to agree to give him private lessons or to let him into your flat and give him a glass of water, right? Oh my God. Before he leaves Lindsay's flat again, having had his drink of water, because he did all that running and was very, very thirsty, although, you know, he's the one who made the choice to chase after a stranger who obviously wanted him to fuck off. Sorry. And also having met Lindsay's two flatmates and having got Lindsay to agree to give him a lesson in a cafe on the coming Saturday, he does a quick sketch of Lindsay, signs it with his name, mobile number and email address and hands it to her. Now, I get why he gave her his name and contact details, but I don't get why he drew a sketch of her. Hadn't he already acted weird enough by then? Unbelievably, and sadly enough, Lindsay herself doesn't seem to think so. When she subsequently related this incident to her parents on Facebook, she said at the end, quote, "Love you lots, don't worry about the guy who chased me home, it's just crazy Japan," unquote. This turned out to be Lindsay's last ever Facebook activity. It's around 10 AM on the following Saturday. After a very productive hour of English tuition with Lindsay in the cafe, Ichihashi invites his teacher to accompany him to his flat so that he can pay her since, whoopsie him, he left his wallet behind. Before going up to his flat, Lindsay tells the cabbie, who's just dropped both her and her student off, to give her a minute to nip up to her student's flat with the guy himself, and then, on her return, he can take her to her next engagement. After waiting around 7 minutes for the young English woman to come back down, however, the cabbie leaves without her. Police only bother investigating Lindsay's disappearance when she has missed 2 days of work and hasn't, in those same 2 days, either been seen by anyone or contacted anyone. They knew where to look for her since Lindsay's 2 flatmates have shown them the sketch of Lindsay that Ichihashi had done, which he had, to remind you, signed with his name, phone number and email address. On entering Ichihashi's home, they see clear signs of a struggle, with Lindsay's belongings strewn all over the place. Lindsay's body itself was discovered in a bathtub which had been moved out onto the balcony. It was completely naked with scarves and plastic ties binding it in some way and with a gag stuffed down the throat. One of the hands was sticking out of the tub while the upper part of the body was full of marks and bruises, evidence of the prolonged and savage attack that Lindsay had suffered before her death, whose cause was strangulation. When I say prolonged, I'm not talking about the 2 minutes that the perpetrator claimed that it took him to end Lindsay's life, but rather the 15 hours of unbearable pain, as attested by the subsequent autopsy of her body, that Lindsay suffered, which only ended when the perpetrator decided to strangle the life out of her. Similarly, when I say savage, I have in mind, first of all, the fact that the second that Lindsay walked into his flat, the perpetrator turned round and punched her square in the face. Lindsay fought her attacker with everything she had, having, like the perpetrator himself coincidentally enough, a level of martial arts training. However, as a black belt, making him a substantially more advanced martial artist than his victim, and as the bigger and stronger of the two by far, Ichihashi had the obvious advantage, and with it, he won the fight. The perpetrator was a horticulturist. He had buried Lindsay's body in the bathtub with a mix of sand and soil, to which he had added an active decomposition agent to get the body to dissolve. He knew, likewise, that the flower seeds that he had then placed on top would feed off the body, again accelerating its decomposition. To complete his destruction of his victim, it would seem, the perpetrator had shaved her head bald. On that point, numerous wigs were found in the apartment, leading the police to the idea that the perpetrator was a trans woman whose motivation for murdering Lindsay may have been to use her hair as a wig. Personally, I think that was a crazy idea for the police to have entertained. But anyway, as for the perpetrator himself, Ichihashi was, by the time of the police raid of his home, on the run. Yes, he had somehow given all 9 of the coppers who had been waiting for him outside his home when he opened the front door the slip, fleeing barefoot, no less. So, was it boredom, the need for excitement, combined with his cold-hearted nature and, given his reputation for being controlling, his desire to both derive and exercise control over someone that led the perpetrator to do what he did to his victim, namely battering her, raping her, and then strangling her to death? That's what Ichihashi did, you see, and in my ignorant opinion, yes, he committed those acts for the reasons that I've just suggested. Rape itself, for instance, isn't usually motivated by a desire for sex per se. It comes, rather, from a desire to hurt, humiliate, and defeat a person. So does murder. As for the act of battering Lindsay, this was clearly to make her too weak to fight back. Shaving his victim's head bald was, I initially thought, another way for the perpetrator to humiliate and defeat his victim even after her death. But Lindsay's father himself later said that of all human tissue that is bound to decompose, hair takes the longest to decompose, and that this then was why the perpetrator shaved Lindsay's hair off. A few days after Lindsay's murder, a young woman turned up at the perpetrator's apartment block wanting to see the perpetrator, but finding the block sealed off by the police. The woman possibly still had echoes of the heated and prolonged argument that she had had with her ex-boyfriend, none other than the day before the man hit on Lindsay. This very shouting match would later become an element of the perpetrator's official defence, but would very easily be defeated by the prosecution with numerous obvious counter-arguments, including the fact that the perpetrator took his victim's life all of 6 days after that alleged heated row. I think I gave the impression earlier that I thought that Lindsay was somehow stupid and that she should have had the sense to kick Ichihashi to the curb, because remember, I basically said how insane it was of her to let the guy into her flat and to agree to give him private lessons. Well, don't we all wish that she'd started screaming on the street when he started chasing her, so that people on the street would hopefully have come to her rescue, or so that the guy would have got scared of being caught and then just run away? Don't we all wish that she hadn't let him into her flat, even though her 2 flatmates were in, and then agreed to give the guy lessons? What wouldn't we give for her not to have gone to the cafe that Saturday and given the guy a lesson, or for her not to have gone to his apartment with him, or for her to have just waited in the cab while he went and got the money and then brought it out to her, for instance, instead of going into his flat with him? Ultimately though, Lindsay didn't rape herself and then strangle herself to death. Tatsuya Ichihashi did, and he alone then is to blame for Lindsay's rape and murder. Not that you'd get that impression from what the man said 4 years later in court, where he testified that he only strangled Lindsay to death to stop her screaming so that his neighbours wouldn't be alerted to what he was doing to her, battering her and raping her to be exact. Oh, in that case, murdering her was fine, you sick fucking cunt. For the next 2.5 years, the perpetrator lived a transient and isolated existence, which was too fucking good for him, moving between cities and rural areas to avoid suspicion. He lived in cheap accommodation, avoided electronic transactions, and worked as a manual labourer at construction sites, where he blended in with other transient workers. He avoided forming any personal relationships and lived in anonymity while growing his hair long, losing weight, and wearing masks out in public. All for reasons that I imagine you can just about fathom. As media coverage of the case intensified, however, his photo continuing to be widely circulated. He cut off the moles on his left cheek with a box cutter, cut off a strip of his lower lip with some scissors in order to make the lip smaller, and changed the look of his nose by means of a piece of thread. Again, I'm of the view that you can somehow tell why the man did those things, and I'll tell you this, however much those things may have hurt him, I personally wish they'd hurt him twice as much as he hurt Lindsay. In any event, the police were up in their game, so to speak, in their hunt for Ichihashi, circulating wanted posters, monitoring transport hubs, collaborating with the media to keep the man's face in the public eye, and enlisting the assistance of Yakuza, of course. And frankly, with none other than the Japanese MAFIA in their service, the police can't fail to catch up with their target now. Well, actually they can, and they did, the perpetrator's eventual apprehension coming from a source other than Yakuza. Police got checkpoints set up, increased their patrols, and offered a reward for any information leading to the perpetrator's capture. They continued to investigate the man's past connections and, on being tipped off that the perpetrator had changed the way he looked, they visited a number of plastic surgery clinics, exactly as the perpetrator himself had been doing, on realising that, even after his self-inflicted plastic surgery, he still mainly looked the same. And sure enough, one day in October 2009, Ichihashi visited a plastic surgery clinic in Nagoya to undergo a range of facial procedures. During the consultation, clinic staff noticed unusual scars on his face, which raised suspicions about his identity. Recognising a resemblance to the fugitive's widely circulated images, they discreetly photographed him and provided the images to the police. And this is how, one day in the following month, Ichihashi was finally nabbed the moment he tried to board a ferry heading to Okinawa, where he had hoped to disappear into further obscurity. I should specify that, having since had a nose job, cheek implants and eyelid surgery, the perpetrator was unrecognisable to how he'd looked before. Even so, unlike in the case of his first encounter with the police 2.5 years before, not only did he not deny who he was or what he had done, he went quietly. The outcome of Ichihashi's trial, which took place in mid-2011, was a sentence of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for the perpetrator. Lindsay's parents had pushed for the death penalty, but in Japan, capital punishment can only be imposed where a person has committed more than one murder. Notwithstanding, in an attempt to atone for his acts, Ichihashi wrote a book called Until I Was Arrested, in which he recounts his experiences from his 2.5 years on the run. But when he offered Lindsay's family the royalties from his work, which sold millions of copies nationwide, they immediately refused. Nothing in the world could give them back what he had taken from them. Even more controversially, in 2013, a film adaptation of Ichihashi's novel was released in Japan. However, the filmmakers were slated by many for portraying the killer, apparently, in a sympathetic light, and equally, for failing to consult Lindsay's family at any point before the release of the picture. Meanwhile, over in the US, the film was banned. Haha, shame on the fucking filmmakers. Whew, poor Lindsay Hawker. If this video has gripped you, I recommend you to watch this one next. I'll meet you there.